Hey guys, picture this. It's 1260, you're a farmer somewhere in the Middle East, and you wake up to discover that literally the most terrifying army in human history is galloping toward your village. No, it's not your in-laws visiting for the holidays, it's the Mongols. And they've just finished turning Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, into what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Sweet dreams, right? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Now, let me paint you a picture of just how spectacularly terrifying the 13th century was. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that somewhere out there, an army exists that has literally never lost a major battle. Ever. These aren't your garden variety medieval warriors who spend half their time arguing about whose turn it is to sharpen the swords. No, these are the Mongols, a people so efficient at warfare that they made the Roman legions look like a weekend paintball team. The Mongol Empire by 1260 stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. Let that sink in for a moment. These nomadic horsemen had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar and Napoleon combined. And they did it all without GPS, smartphones or even decent road maps. Just pure, unadulterated military genius mixed with a healthy dose of, we don't care if you surrender, we're still going to make your city disappear. But here's where our story gets deliciously absurd. Standing in the way of this unstoppable force was an army of former slaves. Yes, you heard that right. Slaves. The MAMLUKS, whose name literally means owned in Arabic, were about to attempt something that would make David versus Goliath look like a fair fight. Except David was a slave, Goliath had already killed literally millions of people, and the sling was facing an entire army of giants who rode horses and shot arrows with the accuracy of medieval laser-guided missiles. Let me tell you about these MAMLUKS, because their origin story reads like something out of a particularly dark fantasy novel. Picture this. You're a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, living peacefully with your family somewhere in the Caucasus region. Life isn't great. This is the 13th century after all, so your biggest entertainment is probably watching paint dry, except paint hasn't been invented yet, so you're watching mud dry instead. Then one day, slave traders arrive. They're not looking for adults. Adults are set in their ways, harder to train, more likely to remember their families and try to escape. No, they want children. Fresh, malleable minds they can shape into the perfect warriors. So, congratulations, kid. You've just been selected for the world's most horrifying boarding school. You're shipped off to Egypt, where you'll be converted to Islam, trained in military tactics, and molded into a professional killing machine. The curriculum includes such delightful subjects as advanced sword fighting, how to shoot a bow while galloping, and creative ways to intimidate your enemies. There's no summer vacation, no graduation ceremony, and definitely no student loans, because technically you're property. But here's the beautiful irony of medieval politics. These slave soldiers became so good at their job that they eventually overthrew their masters and took control of Egypt and Syria themselves. It's like training your guard dog so well that it ends up running the entire household and making you sleep in the doghouse. The Mamluks looked around one day and said, "You know what? We're excellent at warfare. We control all the military power, and our owners are getting soft from too much palace living. Why don't we just take over?" And they did. By 1250, the Mamluks had established their own sultanate, proving that sometimes the best way to break your chains is to first become really, really good at using weapons. They controlled Egypt, the Levant, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Not bad for a bunch of former slaves who started their careers being sold like livestock. Now, let's talk about their opponents, because the Mongols weren't just any ordinary conquerors. They were the result of what happens when you take the most warlike people on earth and give them a leader who makes Napoleon look like a peaceful diplomat. Genghis Khan had died decades earlier, but his legacy lived on through his descendants, who had inherited not just his empire, but his particular brand of diplomacy, which involved sending envoys with messages that essentially said, "Surrender now, and we'll only kill most of you. Resist, and we'll kill all of you, your livestock, your crops, and salt the earth so nothing grows for generations." The Mongol war machine was terrifyingly efficient. They moved faster than any army before them, travelled lighter, and had a communication system that would make modern militaries jealous. They could coordinate attacks across thousands of miles using nothing but horsemen and signal fires. Their tactics were so advanced that military academies still study them today. They perfected psychological warfare before psychology was even a word. They'd leave one survivor in every city they destroyed, just to spread the word about what happened to the others. Comment below and let me know. Would you rather face the Mongols in battle or deal with medieval dentistry? Because honestly, both options seem equally terrifying. By 1258, the Mongols had done something that sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. They had captured and completely destroyed Baghdad. This wasn't just any city. This was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic learning, culture, and power for over 500 years. Baghdad was to the medieval Islamic world what Rome was to the Romans, what Paris is to the French, what New York is to, well, New Yorkers who think their city is the center of the universe. The destruction of Baghdad was so thorough, so complete, that it traumatized an entire civilization. The Mongols didn't just conquer the city, they obliterated it. They killed the Caliph, destroyed the House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the Islamic world, and slaughtered so many people that the Tigris River reportedly ran red with blood. Contemporary accounts, though probably exaggerated, claimed that 1 million people died. Even if that number is inflated, the psychological impact was devastating. It was like watching someone burn down Harvard, Oxford, and the Library of Congress all at once, while simultaneously ending a 1,000-year-old dynasty. The message was clear. Nobody was safe. Not the greatest cities, not the most powerful rulers, not the holiest sites. The Mongols were coming, and they didn't care about your history, your culture, or your prayers. They cared about conquest, and they were really, really good at it. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn. After destroying Baghdad, the Mongol army split up. Part of it headed toward Europe, because apparently destroying one civilization at a time wasn't efficient enough for them. But the main force, led by a general named Kitbuka, who was, ironically, a Nestorian Christian commanding a primarily Muslim and Buddhist army under pagan Mongol leadership, medieval multiculturalism at its finest, headed south toward Egypt and the Mamluk Sultanate. Now, imagine you're Sultan Qutuz of Egypt. You've just received word that Baghdad has fallen. The reports are so horrific that some of your advisors are suggesting you pack up the treasury and relocate to Morocco, or maybe take up farming in some remote village where hopefully the Mongols will never find you. The most powerful military force in human history is heading your way, and you command an army of former slaves. This is where medieval politics gets wonderfully absurd. Qutuz wasn't even supposed to be sultan. He had murdered his way to the throne just a few years earlier, which in medieval terms was considered standard operating procedure. His claim to legitimacy was basically, I killed the previous guy, and I have more swords than anyone who disagrees with me. Not exactly a platform you'd run on in a modern democracy, but perfectly reasonable for 13th century Egypt. The Mongols, confident in their reputation and previous victories, did what they always did. They sent envoys demanding surrender. Their message was typically subtle. Submit to us, and you might live. Resist, and we'll turn your cities into graveyards and your fields into deserts. Also, we've never lost a major battle, so you might want to consider your options carefully. Most rational leaders would have looked at the Mongol track record and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. After all, these were the people who had conquered China, destroyed Kiev, and turned Baghdad into a monument to their military efficiency. Fighting them wasn't just dangerous, it was statistically inadvisable. But Qutuz did something that shocked everyone, including probably himself. He killed the Mongol envoys. Let me repeat that. He killed the Mongol envoys. The representatives of the most feared military force in human history showed up at his court, essentially offering him a chance to surrender and keep some semblance of power, and he responded by having them executed and their heads displayed on the gates of Cairo. This was either the bravest or the most spectacularly stupid decision in medieval history, depending on your perspective. It was like responding to a police officer's speeding ticket by setting his car on fire. Technically making a statement, but probably not the outcome you were hoping for. Tell me in the comments, do you think Qutuz was brilliant or completely insane? Because honestly, the line between genius and madness gets pretty blurry when you're dealing with medieval politics. The execution of the Mongol envoys meant there was no going back. In Mongol culture, killing ambassadors was not just an act of war. It was a personal insult that demanded the complete annihilation of whoever was responsible. The Mongols didn't just want to conquer Egypt now, they wanted to make it an example. They wanted to ensure that no one would ever again be foolish enough to kill Mongol envoys. So Qutuz had managed to transform a standard military conquest into a blood feud. Congratulations, Sultan. You've just made this personal. The Mongol army began its march south, and with each passing day, the reports reaching Cairo became more terrifying. Cities surrendered without a fight. Those that resisted were destroyed so thoroughly that archaeologists today are still trying to figure out where some of them used to stand. The Mongol war machine was in full operation, and it was heading straight for Egypt. But Qutuz, having already committed himself to this course of action, decided to double down. Instead of waiting in Cairo for the Mongols to arrive and besiege him, he made another decision that seemed to defy all military logic. He would march out to meet them in open battle. This was like challenging a professional heavyweight boxer to a fight when you've never been in a ring before. The Mongols were masters of open-field combat. Their entire military system was designed around mobility, archery, and tactical flexibility, exactly the kind of warfare that played to their strengths. Meanwhile, the MAMLUKS, despite being excellent warriors, had no experience fighting an enemy like this. And so, in the summer of 1260, two armies began converging on a small valley in northern Palestine called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. The name would prove to be either prophetic or ironic, depending on how you looked at it. The Mongols were certainly Goliath in this scenario. Whether the Mamluks could pull off a David-like victory remained to be seen. But before we get to that epic confrontation, let me set the stage for what was about to become one of the most important battles in human history. A battle that would determine whether the Islamic world would survive, whether the Mongol expansion would continue into Africa, and whether a bunch of former slaves could do what no other army had managed: stop the unstoppable Mongols. So where were we? Oh right, Sultan Qutuz had just made the medieval equivalent of poking a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick. The Mongol envoys were dead, their heads decorating Cairo's gates like some macabre medieval art installation, and the most feared army in human history was now personally offended and heading straight for Egypt. Picture the scene in Cairo as word spread that the Sultan had essentially declared war on the Mongols. The reaction was probably similar to what you'd expect if someone announced they were planning to fistfight a hurricane. People started making very practical preparations, like writing their wills, saying goodbye to their families, and wondering if it was too late to convert to Christianity and flee to Europe. Because surely, they reasoned, even the Black Death would be preferable to facing Mongol arrows. But Qutuz, having already committed himself to this spectacularly dangerous course of action, began preparing for what everyone assumed would be Egypt's final battle. He sent out messengers across his territory with a message that was both inspiring and terrifying. Every able-bodied man was to report for military service immediately. This wasn't a request. It was a conscription order backed by the very real threat of execution for anyone who refused. Imagine being a simple merchant or farmer in the 13th century Egypt and receiving this news. Yesterday, your biggest worry was whether your crops would survive the season, or if you could afford to buy that new donkey you'd been eyeing. Today, you're being handed a sword and told to prepare to fight the Mongols. The same Mongols who had just finished turning Baghdad into a cautionary tale about the dangers of resisting their will. The recruitment process must have been a sight to behold. Picture Egyptian officials going door to door. "Good morning, Ahmed. Nice weather we're having. By the way, the Sultan needs you to help fight the most feared army in human history. Can you be at the barracks by Thursday? Bring your own sword if you have one. Drop a comment and let me know. Would you have volunteered to fight the Mongols, or would you have suddenly developed a mysterious illness that required immediate travel to a distant relative's house in Morocco?" But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Despite the seemingly hopeless situation, something remarkable began to happen. The Mamluks, these former slave soldiers, started displaying a level of military organization and tactical thinking that would have impressed Julius Caesar. They weren't just panicking, they were planning. You see, the Mamluks had one significant advantage that their enemies didn't fully appreciate. They had been trained from childhood to be professional soldiers. While most medieval armies were composed of farmers who picked up swords during wartime, or knights who spent more time managing their estates than practicing warfare, the Mamluks were career warriors. Fighting wasn't their side job, it was their entire existence. Their training regime would make modern special forces weep. They practiced archery until they could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. They learned to fight with swords, maces, lances, and their bare hands. They studied tactics, logistics, and battlefield psychology. Most importantly, they were taught to function as a unit, not as a collection of individual warriors seeking personal glory. Sultan Qutuz began implementing a strategy that was either brilliant or completely insane. And in medieval warfare, those two things often looked identical. Instead of waiting in Cairo for the Mongols to besiege him, he decided to march out and meet them in open battle. This was like voluntarily stepping into a boxing ring with someone who had never lost a fight, but Qutuz had his reasons. First, he understood that besieging Cairo would give the Mongols time to bring up their full army and siege equipment. The longer he waited, the more overwhelming the Mongol advantage would become. Second, he realized that the psychological impact of the Mongol reputation was almost as dangerous as their actual military capability. Every day his soldiers spent thinking about the approaching enemy was another day for fear to erode their fighting spirit. But most importantly, Qutuz had studied the Mongol fighting style and identified what he believed was a weakness. The Mongols were masters of mobility and archery, but they relied heavily on their reputation for psychological warfare. They expected enemies to be demoralized before the fighting even began. What would happen, Qutuz wondered, if they faced an enemy who refused to be intimidated? Meanwhile, the Mongol army was having its own internal drama. Their commander, General Kitbuka, was facing a problem that even the great Mongol military machine couldn't easily solve: logistics. Feeding and supplying a massive army while on campaign was challenging enough when you controlled the territory you were marching through. But the Mongols were now moving through hostile territory, where every village might contain enemies, and every water source might be poisoned. Additionally, Kitbuka was dealing with what modern military analysts would recognize as overconfidence. The Mongol army had won so many victories that they had started to believe their own propaganda. They expected cities to surrender at the mere sight of their approach. They planned their campaigns assuming that actual fighting would be minimal. This confidence wasn't entirely unjustified. After all, they had conquered most of the known world using exactly this approach. But overconfidence in warfare is like driving at high speed while texting. It works fine until suddenly it doesn't, and when it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong. The two armies began their approach to what would become the battlefield of Ain Jalut, and the contrast between them was striking. The Mongol army moved with the casual confidence of a force that had never known defeat. They advanced in loose formation, expecting to encounter either immediate surrender or token resistance that could be easily swept aside. The Mamluk army, on the other hand, moved with the desperate precision of men who knew they were probably marching to their deaths, but were determined to make those deaths count for something. Every step was calculated, every formation was practiced, every contingency was planned for. They moved like men who understood that they would get exactly one chance to prove that the impossible was possible. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like to be a common soldier in either of these armies. If you were a Mongol warrior, you had grown up hearing stories of your people's victories. Your father had probably fought in the conquest of China or the destruction of Kiev. Your uncles had ridden with the great Khans across the steppes of Asia. You carried weapons that had been tested in dozens of campaigns, and you rode horses that had been bred for warfare across generations. Victory wasn't just expected, it was assumed. But if you were a Mamluk soldier, your experience was entirely different. You had been torn from your family as a child and trained to be a weapon in human form. You had no homeland to return to, no ancestral victories to inspire you, no family legacy to uphold. All you had was your training, your fellow soldiers, and the knowledge that defeat didn't just mean death. It meant the end of everything you had built since gaining your freedom. In many ways, this made the Mamluks more dangerous than their enemies realized. They had nothing to lose and everything to prove. They were fighting not just for territory or treasure, but for their right to exist as free men rather than slaves. As the armies drew closer to Ain Jalut, both sides began engaging in the medieval equivalent of psychological warfare. The Mongols sent out scouting parties designed to be seen, allowing the Mamluks to observe the size and organization of their force. They wanted their enemies to spend sleepless nights contemplating the impossibility of victory. The Mamluks, meanwhile, made a show of their religious devotion. They held public prayers, consulted religious scholars, and made a great display of their faith in Allah's protection. This wasn't just for show. In an age when divine favor was considered a legitimate military asset, demonstrating religious conviction was a form of psychological warfare in itself. But beneath all the posturing and propaganda, Both armies were making hard-headed military calculations. The Mongols were evaluating terrain, assessing enemy numbers, and planning their traditional tactics of mobility and archery. The Mamluks were studying Mongol movements, looking for patterns, weaknesses, anything that might give them an edge in what everyone expected to be a hopeless fight. What's fascinating is that both sides were probably right in their assessments. The Mongols had every reason to be confident. They had superior numbers, better logistics, more experience, and an unbroken string of victories. The Mamluks had every reason to be terrified. They were about to face an enemy that had never been defeated in a major engagement. But warfare, particularly medieval warfare, had a way of making fools of even the most careful planners. Battles were decided not just by numbers and tactics, but by weather, terrain, individual acts of heroism or cowardice, and pure random chance. The most perfectly planned military campaign could be undone by a horse stumbling at the wrong moment, or a commander making a split-second decision under pressure. Tell me in the comments, do you think the outcome of battles is determined more by planning or by luck? Because what happened at Ain Jalut would suggest that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible. As both armies approached the valley of Ain Jalut, the final preparations began. Weapons were sharpened, prayers were said, and letters were written to families who might never see their sons, fathers, and brothers again. The Mongol commanders held their final strategy meetings, confident in their ability to add another victory to their legendary record. The Mamluk officers made their final dispositions, knowing that they were about to attempt something that had never been done successfully before. The night before the battle, both camps would have been filled with the sounds and smells of armies preparing for combat. The Mongols, experienced in these matters, probably slept well, treating the upcoming engagement as just another day at the office. The Mamluks, facing the unknown, likely spent the night in prayer, in final conversations with comrades, and in the quiet contemplation that comes to men who know they might not live to see another sunset. But dawn was coming, and with it, one of the most important battles in human history. The Mongol war machine was about to meet its first real test since the death of Genghis Khan. The Mamluk experiment in slave-soldier democracy was about to face its ultimate examination, and the fate of the Islamic world, European expansion, and African independence all hung in the balance. The stage was set for what would become known as the Battle of Ain Jalut, the day when the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and the entire course of world history pivoted on the outcome of a single day's fighting in a small valley in Palestine. September 3rd, 1260. Dawn breaks over the valley of Ain Jalut, and if you were a bird flying overhead, you would witness one of the most absurd mismatches in military history about to unfold. On one side, the Mongol army, battle-tested, supremely confident, and equipped with tactics that had conquered half the known world. On the other side, an army of former slaves who had apparently decided that today was a good day to attempt the impossible. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone with a sense of biblical history. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, was supposedly near where David had faced his giant. Except in this case, David was leading an entire army of former slaves, and Goliath was backed by the most efficient killing machine the medieval world had ever produced. The metaphor was either inspiring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. Sultan Qutuz had arrived at the battlefield with approximately 20,000 men. General Kitbuka commanded roughly the same number, but here's where numbers become deceiving. The Mongol force was composed entirely of professional warriors who had been fighting together for years. Every man knew his place, understood the tactics, and had participated in multiple successful campaigns. They moved like a single organism, each unit perfectly coordinated with the others. The Mamluk army, while well-trained, was a mixture of veteran slave soldiers and hastily conscripted locals who had probably been farmers or merchants just weeks earlier. It was like fielding a basketball team where half the players were NBA veterans and the other half were weekend recreational players who had just learned the rules. Theoretically possible to win, but you wouldn't want to bet your life savings on the outcome. But Qutuz had something that military historians often underestimate, a plan that was so crazy it just might work. He had studied every available report about Mongol tactics, and he had identified what he believed was their one weakness. They were supremely confident in their ability to win quickly. The Mongol strategy relied on psychological dominance and rapid victory. What would happen if someone refused to be intimidated and managed to drag out the fight? The battle began, as most medieval engagements did, with both sides trying to look as intimidating as possible. The Mongols deployed in their traditional formation, a wide line of mounted archers backed by heavy cavalry, with reserves positioned to exploit any breakthrough. They advanced at a steady pace, arrows ready, confident that their enemy would either flee immediately or collapse after the first volley. The Mamluks, however, did something unexpected. Instead of charging forward in a heroic but suicidal assault or cowering behind defensive positions, they began a fighting retreat. This wasn't the panicked flight the Mongols were expecting. It was a controlled, disciplined withdrawal that drew the Mongol forces deeper into the valley. Let me explain why this was either brilliant or completely insane. Fighting retreats are incredibly difficult to execute successfully. They require perfect coordination, absolute trust between units, and the ability to maintain formation while under attack. One moment of panic, one unit that breaks and runs, and the entire army dissolves into a massacre. It's like trying to perform surgery while being chased by angry hornets. Theoretically possible, but requiring nerves of steel and perfect technique. The Mongol commanders, watching this retreat, probably assumed they were witnessing the beginning of a typical victory. Enemy armies retreated from Mongol forces all the time, usually right before they disintegrated completely. Kitbuka ordered his forces to pursue, expecting to catch the fleeing Mamluks and destroy them in the traditional fashion. But something strange was happening. The Mamluks weren't running fast enough. They were retreating at exactly the pace needed to stay just out of effective arrow range, while still appearing to be in panicked flight. They were maintaining their formation despite being under constant attack. Most suspiciously, they seemed to know exactly where they were going. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever tried to make something look easy that was actually incredibly difficult? Because that's essentially what the Mamluks were doing, except the stakes were the survival of their entire civilization. As the chase continued deeper into the valley, the Mongol force began to stretch out. The fastest riders pushed ahead, eager to catch the retreating enemy. The heavier units fell behind. The careful formation that had won so many battles began to lose its cohesion. This was exactly what Kutus had been hoping for. You see, the Mongol army was like a perfectly tuned sports car, incredibly effective when operating under ideal conditions, but potentially vulnerable if those conditions changed. Their strength lay in coordinated attacks by massed archers and cavalry. But what if you could separate those units? What if you could turn their speed and aggression against them? At the critical moment, when the Mongol pursuit force had been drawn deep into the valley and was beginning to spread out, Kutus revealed his trap. Hidden Mamluk units, positioned on the valley sides hours before dawn, suddenly emerged from concealment. The retreating Mamluk force abruptly stopped running and turned to fight. In an instant, the hunters became the hunted. The psychological impact on the Mongol forces must have been devastating. For decades, Mongol warriors had grown accustomed to seeing enemies flee at the first sight of their approach. They had never faced an enemy that ran away only to suddenly turn and fight when the odds seemed even worse. It was like chasing a rabbit only to have it suddenly transform into a wolf. But the Mamluks weren't finished with their surprises. As the Mongol forces found themselves surrounded and under attack from multiple directions, Sultan Kutus made his second brilliant tactical decision. Instead of trying to destroy the entire Mongol army at once, which was probably impossible, he focused on creating chaos and confusion in their ranks. The Mamluk attacks weren't designed to achieve immediate victory. They were designed to disrupt Mongol coordination, separate their units, and most importantly, force them to fight the kind of close-quarters battle where Mongol archery and mobility advantages would be minimized. It was like forcing a boxer to fight in a phone booth. Their reach and footwork advantages suddenly became irrelevant. General Kitbuka, realizing that his army had been expertly maneuvered into a trap, attempted to implement standard Mongol tactics for breaking out of encirclement. But here's where the Mamluk training showed its value. These weren't panicky peasants who could be scattered by a determined charge. These were professional warriors who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of fighting. The battle dissolved into a series of smaller engagements throughout the valley. Mongol units that had been separated from their main force found themselves fighting desperate battles against Mamluk forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. The coordination that had made the Mongols so effective began to break down as individual commanders were forced to make split-second decisions without knowledge of the overall tactical situation. What's fascinating about this phase of the battle is how it reversed the usual medieval dynamic. Typically, Mongol forces could see the entire battlefield and coordinate their attacks accordingly. Their enemies, usually less mobile and less organized, would find themselves reacting to Mongol initiatives. But at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks had managed to create a situation where the Mongols were reacting to them. In the chaos of close combat, individual skill and training became crucial, and here's where the Mamluk childhood training program showed its value. While Mongol warriors were certainly skilled, they were accustomed to fighting as part of a coordinated whole. When that coordination broke down, they were forced to rely on individual combat ability. The Mamluks, on the other hand, had been trained from childhood to excel at individual combat. They had practiced sword fighting, archery, and hand-to-hand combat until these skills were as automatic as breathing. When the battle devolved into individual duels and small group engagements, the Mamluks found themselves on equal footing with their supposedly superior enemies. But the most important moment of the battle came when General Kitbuka himself was killed in combat. The exact details are disputed by historians. Some say he was shot by arrows while trying to rally his troops. Others claim he died in hand-to-hand combat with Mamluk soldiers. What's not disputed is the psychological impact of his death on the Mongol forces. In Mongol military culture, commanders led from the front. They were expected to be visible to their troops, to share the dangers of combat, and to provide personal examples of courage. This usually worked to their advantage, as seeing their leader fighting bravely inspired ordinary soldiers to greater efforts. But it also meant that the death of a commander could have catastrophic effects on army morale. When word spread through the Mongol ranks that Kitbuka was dead, something unprecedented happened. Mongol units began to retreat, not in the organized, tactical withdrawal that professional armies use to reposition themselves, but in the kind of panicked flight that they had seen in so many of their enemies over the decades. The psychological transformation was complete. The army that had never known defeat suddenly found itself experiencing the terror and confusion that they had inflicted on so many others. Units that had fought with supreme confidence just hours earlier were now fleeing in panic, abandoning their wounded and leaving their equipment behind. Tell me in the comments, do you think battles are won more by tactics or by psychology? Because what happened at Ain Jalut suggests that sometimes breaking an enemy's will to fight is more important than breaking their army. Sultan Kutuz, seeing the Mongol retreat beginning, made his final crucial decision of the day. Instead of allowing his troops to pursue the fleeing enemy, which was what every instinct and tradition demanded, he ordered them to maintain formation and secure the battlefield. This showed remarkable discipline and strategic thinking, because pursuing a retreating army often led to the victorious forces becoming scattered and vulnerable to counterattack. But more importantly, Kutuz understood that the real victory wasn't just defeating this particular Mongol army, it was proving that Mongol forces could be defeated at all. The psychological impact of this realization would spread throughout the Islamic world faster than any messenger could travel. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered, and that was worth more than any amount of captured treasure or prisoners. As the dust settled over Ain Jalut and the surviving Mongol forces fled northward, the magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in. An army of former slaves had achieved what no other force had managed. They had defeated the Mongols in open battle. They had taken the most feared military machine in human history and sent it running like scared children. But this victory came at a terrible cost, and the war was far from over. The immediate battle had been won, but the larger conflict between the Islamic world and the Mongol Empire was just beginning. And Sultan Kutuz, the man who had orchestrated this miraculous victory, was about to discover that surviving success could be just as dangerous as facing defeat. So there stood Sultan Kutuz in the aftermath of Ain Jalut, probably looking around at the battlefield littered with Mongol dead and thinking, well, that actually worked. He had just accomplished something that would have seemed as impossible as landing on the moon with a medieval catapult. He had defeated the Mongols in open battle. But if you think this is where our story ends with everyone living happily ever after, you clearly haven't been paying attention to how medieval politics actually worked. Let me paint you a picture of what the immediate aftermath looked like. The valley of Ain Jalut was a scene of absolute carnage. Bodies of men and horses covered the ground. The smell of blood and death hung in the air like a medieval perfume that nobody wanted to wear. Wounded soldiers from both sides cried out for help that might or might not come. And scattered throughout this hellscape were the abandoned weapons and equipment of the Mongol army. The first time in decades that Mongol forces had fled so fast, they left their gear behind. For the Mamluk soldiers, the psychological impact was almost as overwhelming as the physical exhaustion. These men had spent their entire lives being told that the Mongols were invincible, that facing them in battle was tantamount to suicide. Now they stood as living proof that the impossible was possible. It was like discovering that gravity was optional, or that taxes could actually be fair. It fundamentally changed how they saw the world. But Kutuz, being a practical politician as well as a military commander, understood that winning the battle was only the beginning. News of the Mongol defeat would spread like wildfire throughout the known world, but so would news of Mamluk capabilities. He had just announced to every potential enemy that Egypt was now a major military power, which was roughly equivalent to painting a target on his back and sending out invitations to every ambitious warlord in the region. The immediate strategic situation was complex. The Mongol army that had fled Ain Jalut was broken but not destroyed. They would regroup, receive reinforcements, and undoubtedly return seeking revenge. Meanwhile, other Mongol forces were still operating throughout the region. Kutuz had won a battle, but the war was far from over. More pressingly, he had a political problem that was entirely predictable, yet utterly dangerous. His victory had made him a hero, but heroes in medieval politics had a tendency to develop inconveniently large egos, and even more inconvenient numbers of enemies. Success, particularly spectacular military success, was like blood in the water. It attracted every political shark within 1,000 miles. Let me tell you about the delicious irony of medieval politics. Kutuz had risen to power by murdering his predecessor, which in the 13th century terms was considered a perfectly reasonable career advancement strategy. He had then saved the Islamic world from Mongol conquest, securing his place in history as one of the great military leaders of his era. You would think this would guarantee him a long and prosperous reign, surrounded by grateful subjects and loyal supporters. You would be completely wrong. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think success makes leaders more secure or more vulnerable? Because medieval history suggests that nothing is more dangerous than being the person everyone credits with saving civilization. Within weeks of the victory at Ain Jalut, Kutuz began receiving reports that should have made his blood run cold. Various Mamluk commanders were holding private meetings. Ambitious nobles were making discreet inquiries about political support. Most ominously, his own inner circle was displaying the kind of nervous loyalty that usually preceded a coup attempt. The problem was simple. Kutuz had proven that extraordinary military success was possible, which meant that every ambitious person in his kingdom was now wondering if they could achieve similar glory. He had also demonstrated that the established order could be challenged successfully, which unfortunately included his own position as Sultan. But the most immediate threat came from an unexpected source. Among the Mamluk commanders who had fought at Ain Jalut was a man named Baibars, a brilliant military tactician who had played a crucial role in the victory. Baibars was everything you would want in a subordinate. Competent, brave, successful, and completely loyal, right up until the moment he decided to stab you in the back. The relationship between Kutuz and Baibars in the aftermath of Ain Jalut was like watching a medieval version of a buddy cop movie, except both cops were planning to kill each other, and the audience knew exactly how it was going to end. They smiled at each other in public, praised each other's military genius, and probably spent their private time planning each other's funerals. Baibars had his own reasons for being dissatisfied with the post-victory arrangements. He felt that his contributions to the battle hadn't been adequately recognized. More importantly, he believed that he could do a better job of leading the Mamluk state than Kutuz. This was probably true. Baibars was one of the most capable military and political leaders of his generation. Unfortunately for Kutuz, capability in medieval politics was usually demonstrated by successfully murdering your predecessor. The broader historical context makes this personal drama even more significant. The victory at Ain Jalut had sent shockwaves throughout both the Islamic and Mongol worlds. In Baghdad, the few survivors of the Mongol destruction probably wept with relief upon hearing that the seemingly unstoppable conquerors could be defeated. In Cairo, crowds celebrated in the streets, praising Allah for delivering them from destruction. But in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, the news of Kitbuka's defeat and death was received with a very different emotion: rage. The great Khan Munka had died in 1259, and his successors were already dealing with succession disputes and internal conflicts. The last thing they needed was news that their supposedly invincible army had been humiliated by a bunch of former slaves. The defeat at Ain Jalut wasn't just a military setback, it was a challenge to the fundamental basis of Mongol power. However, The Mongol response was complicated by the fact that their empire was simultaneously expanding in multiple directions and facing internal succession crises. They couldn't immediately dispatch another massive army to avenge Ain Jalut, because they were already overextended fighting wars in China, Central Asia and Eastern Europe. This gave the Islamic world a breathing space that wouldn't last forever, but might last long enough to prepare better defences. Meanwhile, the news of the Mamluk victory was spreading throughout Europe, where Christian rulers were simultaneously relieved and concerned. Relieved because the Mongol expansion toward their territories had been checked. Concerned because a strong Islamic power in Egypt and Syria meant that their dreams of reclaiming the Holy Land had become significantly more complicated. Tell me in the comments, do you think the Crusades would have been different if the European rulers had known that the Islamic world was about to save itself? Because the timing of Ain Jalut fundamentally changed the balance of power in the entire region. But back to our main characters, who were busy plotting each other's demise while pretending to be the best of friends. The tension between Qutuz and Baibars reached a breaking point during the march back to Cairo. Qutuz, probably sensing that his position was becoming precarious, made a decision that was either politically brilliant or spectacularly stupid. He announced his intention to lead a campaign to recapture territories that had been lost to various enemies over the years. This announcement had multiple purposes. It would allow him to maintain the military momentum from Ain Jalut, keep his commanders focused on external enemies rather than internal politics, and potentially win additional victories that would further cement his legitimacy. It was also a way of keeping potential rivals busy with military campaigns rather than palace intrigue. Baibars, however, interpreted this announcement differently. He saw it as evidence that Qutuz was planning to consolidate power and eliminate potential rivals. Whether this interpretation was correct is debatable, but in medieval politics, perception was often more important than reality. If Baibars believed that Qutuz was planning to move against him, then he had every incentive to move first. On October 24, 1260, less than 2 months after his great victory at Ain Jalut, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated by his own commanders during a hunting expedition. The official story was that it was a spontaneous act during a dispute, but historians generally agree that it was a carefully planned coup led by Baibars and other ambitious Mamluk officers. Let that irony sink in for a moment. The man who saved the Islamic world from Mongol conquest, who achieved the impossible by defeating the most feared army in human history, who secured the independence of Egypt and Syria for centuries to come, was murdered by his own subordinates before he could even properly celebrate his victory. It's like writing the greatest symphony of all time and then being strangled by your own orchestra before you can take a bow. Medieval politics was not known for its gratitude or job security. Baibars immediately claimed the Sultanate, and because he controlled the loyalty of the army and had just demonstrated his willingness to eliminate rivals, his claim was generally accepted. This began what historians call the Bahri Mamluk period, during which the Mamluks consolidated their control over Egypt and Syria and continued the war against both the Mongols and the remaining Crusader states. Under Baibars' leadership, the Mamluks became one of the dominant military powers of the medieval world. They successfully repelled additional Mongol invasions, gradually conquered the remaining Crusader territories, and established a political and military system that would control Egypt for over 2 centuries. In many ways, Baibars proved to be exactly the kind of leader that the situation required: ruthless, capable, and absolutely committed to Mamluk independence. But here's the thing about historical irony. Baibars succeeded precisely because he built on the foundation that Qutuz had established. The victory at Ain Jalut had broken the myth of Mongol invincibility, demonstrated that the Mamluk military system could compete with the best armies in the world, and established the psychological confidence that the Islamic world needed to resist foreign conquest. The long-term consequences of Ain Jalut rippled throughout world history in ways that the participants could never have imagined. The Mongol expansion into Africa was permanently halted, which meant that the kingdoms of Nubia, Ethiopia, and the various West African empires never had to face Mongol invasion. European expansion into the eastern Mediterranean was delayed by centuries because the Mamluks provided an effective check on Christian military power in the region. Most importantly, the survival of a strong Islamic power in Egypt and Syria ensured that trade routes between Europe and Asia remained under Islamic control, which contributed to European motivations for finding alternative routes to the East, motivations that would eventually lead to the age of exploration and the discovery of the Americas. Think about that for a moment. The fact that a bunch of former slave soldiers decided to fight the Mongols instead of surrendering helped set in motion the chain of events that led to Columbus sailing west in search of Asia. History is connected in ways that make chaos theory look straightforward. But perhaps the most profound consequence of Ain Jalut was what it demonstrated about human potential. The MAMLUKS were men who had been sold as children, torn from their families, and treated as property. They had every reason to accept their fate as powerless victims of historical forces beyond their control. Instead, they transformed themselves into the saviors of their civilization. Their story reminds us that some of history's most important moments come when people refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable, when ordinary individuals decide that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses, when former slaves look at the most feared army in human history and say, "You know what? Not today." So the next time someone tells you that something is impossible, remember the Battle of Ain Jalut. Remember that on September 3rd, 1260, in a small valley in Palestine, a group of former slaves proved that the impossible was just another word for we haven't figured out how to do it yet. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most important lesson. History has to teach us that, and the fact that medieval politics was absolutely brutal, even for the people who saved civilization, especially for the people who saved civilization. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's most improbable victories. Drop a comment letting me know what other impossible historical moments you'd like to explore, because trust me, this isn't even close to the weirdest thing that actually happened in the past. History is full of moments that make fiction look realistic and coincidence look planned. Until next time, remember, the past was a nightmare, but at least it was an interesting nightmare. Picture this. You're complaining about your hotel room being too cold because the air conditioning is set to 68 degrees. Meanwhile, somewhere in medieval Europe, a peasant named Wilhelm is trying to decide whether to freeze to death in his bed or get eaten alive by the rats that have made his straw mattress their winter palace. Spoiler alert, neither option ends well, and central heating won't be invented for another few centuries. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval sleeping arrangements, where hypothermia was a lifestyle choice and privacy was about as common as a unicorn with a college degree. If you think your living situation is rough, just wait until you hear what our ancestors considered a good night's rest. Trust me, after this, you'll never complain about thread count again. So grab your warmest blanket, turn up that thermostat you take for granted, and let's dive into the frozen nightmare that was bedtime in the Dark Ages. And hey, if you've ever wondered whether you could survive as a medieval peasant, drop a comment below with your best survival strategy. Spoiler alert, you probably couldn't, but let's pretend together. Now, let's start with the obvious question. Where exactly did these poor souls lay their weary heads when the temperature dropped below mildly uncomfortable and straight into penguin territory? The answer, my friends, is everywhere and nowhere, all at the same time. It's like a riddle wrapped in a mystery covered in fleas and seasoned with the bitter taste of desperation. First, let's talk about the medieval peasant house, a structure so generously designed that it makes a studio apartment look like a mansion. These architectural marvels were typically one-room affairs, measuring roughly the size of your modern walk-in closet. The entire family, including Grandma Gertrude with her chronic coughing fits, little Timmy with his impressive collection of intestinal worms, and the family pig who was somehow considered both livestock and roommate, all shared this cozy space. The walls were made of wattle and daub, which sounds like a fancy building technique until you realize it's basically sticks, mud, and animal dung, mixed together with the hopes and dreams of people who clearly had never heard of insulation. These walls had about as much thermal efficiency as a fishing net, which meant that when winter arrived, the inside temperature was typically just a few degrees warmer than the frozen wasteland outside. And by a few degrees, I mean sometimes it was actually colder inside because at least outside you had the sun occasionally. The roof, if you could call it that, was made of thatch, essentially dried grass and straw piled up and held together by prayer and the occasional heavy stone. This created a lovely ecosystem where mice, rats, birds, and various insects could live rent-free while slowly decomposing and dropping bits of themselves onto the sleeping family below. Nothing says sweet dreams quite like a dead sparrow landing on your face at 3 in the morning. But here's where things get really interesting. The floor was usually just packed dirt, because apparently wooden floors were for rich people, and people who didn't enjoy the authentic medieval experience of sleeping directly on the earth like their ancestors had done for thousands of years. Sometimes, if they were feeling fancy, They might sprinkle some rushes or straw on the ground, creating a lovely carpet that doubled as a toilet for the family animals and a breeding ground for every parasite known to medieval medicine, which is to, say, none of them. Now, you might be thinking, surely they had beds, right? I mean, even cavemen had beds. Oh, my sweet, naive, centrally heated friend. Medieval peasants did have beds, technically. They were called bed frames in the loosest possible sense of the term. Picture a wooden frame, if wood was available and they weren't using it for more important things like not starving or building farm tools. More often, it was just a raised platform made of whatever they could scrounge together. Old boards, stones, bundles of sticks, or if they were really living the high life, actual purpose-built wooden planks. On top of this frame went the mattress, a term that I use so loosely it's practically falling apart. The medieval mattress was typically a sack made of rough cloth, often just old grain sacks repurposed for sleeping, filled with whatever was available. Straw was the premium option, the memory foam of the Middle Ages. If they were really well off, they might have some hay, which was basically straw's more expensive cousin, but more often than not, it was filled with leaves, moss, or whatever plant matter hadn't rotted yet. But wait, there's more. These mattresses were shared. Not just shared like you might share a king-size bed with your partner. No, we're talking about entire families piling onto one straw-filled sack like medieval sardines. Mom, Dad, little Billy, teenage Sally, grandmother Agnes, baby Martha, and occasionally the neighbour's kid whose parents had died of plague the week before, all snuggled together in a way that would make a modern fire marshal have a nervous breakdown. And let's talk about the bedding situation, because this is where things go from merely uncomfortable to actively nightmarish. Blankets were a luxury item, like spices or literacy. Most families had maybe 1 or 2 woolen blankets that had been passed down through generations, accumulating decades of human oils, dirt, and the occasional bloodstain from various medieval mishaps. These blankets were never washed. Water was for drinking and cooking, not for the frivolous luxury of cleanliness. Instead of proper sheets, they used whatever fabric scraps they could find. Old tunics, worn-out cloaks, or pieces of cloth so threadbare you could read through them served as bedding. The concept of changing sheets was about as foreign as the concept of democracy, or basic human rights. You got one set of bedding per lifetime and you made it work. The pillow situation was equally dire. A pillow was basically a smaller version of the mattress. A cloth bag filled with straw, feathers if you were incredibly lucky, or more often, just balled up rags or clothes. The wealthy peasants might have had a pillow stuffed with goose feathers, but for most people the pillow was their bundled up cloak or tunic, which they needed to wear during the day, creating a delightful cycle of never having enough clothes to stay warm. But here's the real kicker about medieval sleeping arrangements. They weren't really designed for sleeping through the night. The concept of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep was as foreign to them as space travel, or the idea that maybe, just maybe, bathing more than once a year might be a good idea. Medieval people practiced what historians call segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night for a few hours of activity before going back to sleep until dawn. What did they do during these midnight wake periods, you ask? Well, they might tend to the fire if they were lucky enough to have one. They would check on the animals, because nothing says goodnight quite like making sure your pig hadn't frozen to death. They would pray, because when your entire existence is a series of barely survivable disasters, you tend to develop a pretty serious relationship with whatever deities might be listening. And sometimes, if they were feeling particularly adventurous and the stars aligned just right, they might engage in the one activity that didn't require any resources, didn't cost any money, and help keep them warm, making more little peasants to continue the family tradition of barely surviving. This brings us to another delightful aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Remember, the entire family shared one room and often one bed. When little Timmy asked where babies came from, his parents didn't need to have the talk. He had front row seats to the entire production. Nothing builds character quite like listening to your parents attempt to quietly conceive your future sibling while you're trying to sleep 3 inches away, surrounded by the rest of your family and possibly a goat. The children learned about the facts of life the same way they learned about death, disease, and the general cruelty of existence, through direct, unfiltered exposure. Medieval childhood was basically a crash course in life is suffering, and also you're probably not going to live to see 30, so let's skip the sugarcoating and get straight to the existential dread. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. or rather, the absence of elephants, because the room was too small and cold for elephants, which frankly would have been a considerable improvement. How exactly did these people stay warm when the temperature dropped below freezing, which it did for several months out of the year? The answer is, they mostly didn't. Medieval peasants were cold. Not chilly, not a little uncomfortable, but bone-deep, soul-crushing. I haven't felt my toes in 3 months cold. They were cold when they went to bed, cold while they slept, and cold when they woke up. Being cold was such a constant state of existence that they probably forgot what warmth felt like. It was like being hungry, but for heat instead of food, and just like being hungry, it was simply part of life. The lucky ones might have had a central fire pit in their single room, which provided heat, light, and the constant threat of burning down their straw-filled hovel. These fire pits were basically holes in the ground with stones around them, and the smoke was supposed to escape through a hole in the roof. Supposed to being the key phrase here, because medieval ventilation systems were about as effective as medieval democracy. Most of the smoke just hung around inside, creating a lovely atmosphere that was part sauna, part gas chamber. The fire needed constant tending, which meant someone had to stay awake to feed it throughout the night, taking turns like the world's most depressing campfire rotation. And fuel was always a problem. Wood needed to be gathered, dried, and conserved, because once winter truly set in, finding dry firewood became an epic quest worthy of its own medieval ballad. Those who couldn't afford to keep a fire going all night, which was most people, relied on the revolutionary medieval heating technology known as huddling together for warmth. The entire family would pile onto their shared mattress like a human, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to not die of hypothermia before morning. Imagine trying to sleep while pressed against several other people, all of whom haven't bathed in months, wearing clothes that haven't been washed since they were made, in a room that smells like a combination of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, and whatever mysterious substances were decomposing in the thatch roof above. And speaking of clothes, medieval peasants slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. The concept of pyjamas was about as realistic as the concept of indoor plumbing, or the revolutionary idea that maybe illness wasn't caused by bad air or an imbalance of bodily humours. They had one set of clothes, maybe two if they were incredibly well off, and those clothes stayed on their bodies until they literally fell apart from wear and accumulated filth. These clothes were made of rough wool or linen, materials that were about as soft as sandpaper, and about as comfortable as wearing a hair shirt, which, incidentally, some people did wear as a form of religious penance, because apparently regular. Medieval life wasn't quite miserable enough on its own. The truly desperate would employ other warming techniques that speak to the creative problem-solving abilities of people who had absolutely no other options. Some would heat stones by the fire during the day, and then wrap them in cloth to use as medieval hot water bottles, though this came with the ever-present risk of burns or setting your straw bedding on fire, which would solve the cold problem permanently by solving the existence problem. Others would bring their smaller animals into bed with them. Not just cats and dogs, mind you, but chickens, baby goats, and other livestock that could fit onto the family mattress without completely crushing everyone. Nothing says good night's sleep quite like sharing your bed with a chicken that hasn't been house-trained and has its own ideas about appropriate bedtime behaviour. The really creative ones would construct makeshift sleeping areas closer to their animal's body heat. The family cow or pig generated significant warmth, so some families would literally sleep next to their livestock, separated only by whatever barrier they could construct. This had the added benefit of allowing them to quickly respond if someone tried to steal their animals in the night, which was a constant concern because livestock theft was basically the medieval equivalent of Grand Theft Auto. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval peasant sleeping arrangements was how they dealt with the fundamental problem that their housing was essentially designed for survival, not comfort. These weren't homes in any sense that we would recognize. They were shelters, barely adequate barriers between human beings and the hostile environment that was constantly trying to kill them. Every aspect of their sleeping arrangements was a compromise between competing desperations. They needed warmth, but fuel was scarce. They needed privacy, but space was limited. They needed comfort, but materials were expensive. They needed safety, but their homes were made of materials that could burn down in minutes. They needed rest, but hungry animals, crying babies, sick family members, and the constant threat of disaster made peaceful sleep nearly impossible. The result was a sleeping arrangement that would be considered a humanitarian crisis by modern standards, but which represented the absolute best that most people could manage, given the resources and knowledge available to them. It was a system born of necessity, maintained by desperation, and endured because the alternative was death. And yet, somehow, these people survived. They adapted to conditions that would break modern humans within days. They found ways to rest, to recover, to continue functioning, despite circumstances that seem almost impossibly harsh from our perspective of heated homes, comfortable beds, and the basic expectation that sleep should be restful rather than an endurance test. So the next time you're lying in your comfortable bed, under your clean sheets, in your temperature-controlled room, take a moment to appreciate just how incredibly luxurious your sleeping arrangements really are. You're living better than medieval royalty could have dreamed, and infinitely better than the peasants who somehow managed to survive winter after winter in conditions that would make a modern camping trip seem like a 5-star resort experience. But don't get too comfortable just yet. We've barely scratched the surface of this medieval sleeping nightmare. We haven't even talked about the pest control situation, the sanitation challenges, or the delightful array of diseases that thrived in these cozy family sleeping arrangements. And trust me, once you hear about the medieval approach to dealing with lice, fleas, and bedbugs, you'll never take modern pest control for granted again. Now that we've established the basic horror show that was medieval peasant bedrooms, let's dive into the real nightmare fuel, the uninvited guests. And I'm not talking about your annoying relatives who overstay their welcome. I'm talking about the vast ecosystem of parasites, vermin, and disease-carrying creatures that considered your medieval bed their personal 5-star resort and all-you-can-eat buffet. Picture this. You've just settled down for another delightful night of medieval sleep deprivation when you feel something crawling across your face. Is it a spider? A beetle? Your little brother's hand reaching for the last piece of mouldy bread you've been saving? Plot twist. It's all three, plus a few creatures that medieval science couldn't even identify because they were too busy trying to figure out why people kept dying from bad air. Let's start with the absolute champions of medieval bedroom invasion, fleas. These tiny vampires were so common in medieval households that people didn't even consider them pests. They were basically family members. Unwanted, blood-sucking, disease-carrying family members, but family nonetheless. Medieval peasants had fleas the way modern people have dust. It was just an accepted part of existence. Fleas loved medieval living conditions more than a vampire loves a blood bank. The combination of unwashed humans, unwashed animals, unwashed bedding, and the general medieval commitment to never washing anything created a flea paradise that would make modern pest control experts weep with despair. These weren't just any fleas either. Medieval fleas were hardcore survivors that had evolved alongside humans for thousands of years, developing impressive resistance to whatever feeble attempts at pest control medieval people could muster. The medieval approach to flea control was about as effective as their approach to urban planning or dental hygiene, which is to say, completely ineffective with a side order of making things worse. Some people would try to catch fleas by hand, a process that was about as successful as trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Others would use various herbs and plants that were supposed to repel fleas, though the fleas apparently never got the memo and continued their blood-drinking parties with enthusiasm. The really desperate would employ the flea trap method, which involved placing a bowl of water mixed with various substances near the bed, hoping the fleas would jump in and drown themselves. This was about as effective as leaving a strongly worded note asking the fleas to please consider relocating to someone else's house. The fleas, being medieval fleas with medieval attitudes, completely ignored these polite requests and continued their nightly feeding frenzies. But fleas were just the opening act. The headliner of the medieval pest show was the bedbug, a creature so perfectly adapted to making human sleep miserable that you have to wonder if they were specifically designed by some malevolent deity with a twisted sense of humor. Bedbugs were the Navy SEALs of the parasite world. They were stealthy, efficient, and absolutely relentless in their mission to make every moment of rest a living nightmare. Medieval bedbugs were particularly impressive specimens because they had generations of experience dealing with medieval living conditions. They had evolved to thrive in environments that would challenge modern bedbugs. These weren't your contemporary bedbugs that need heated apartments and regular cleaning. These were hardcore medieval bedbugs that could survive in conditions that would make a cockroach file a complaint with the health department. The medieval approach to bedbug control was a masterclass in futility. Some people would regularly beat their mattresses, which accomplished nothing except giving the bedbugs a nice massage, and possibly making them even more aggressive. Others would try burning various herbs or substances to smoke out the bugs, which mainly succeeded in filling their already poorly ventilated homes with even more toxic smoke. The truly optimistic would completely remake their beds with fresh straw, convinced that this time surely they had defeated the bedbugs once and for all. The bedbugs, meanwhile, were probably having meetings in the walls, discussing their strategic plans for recolonizing the fresh bedding and comparing notes on which family members had the sweetest blood. And then there were the lice. Personal lice, head lice, body lice, basically every type of lice that evolution could devise. Lice were so common in medieval times that having them was considered normal, and not having them was actually suspicious. If you didn't have lice, people wondered what was wrong with you. Were you some kind of unnatural creature? Were you cursed? Did you bathe too much? Because excessive bathing was considered unhealthy and possibly immoral. Medieval lice were like tiny livestock that you carried with you everywhere. They lived in your hair, in your clothes, in your bedding, and they had a social structure more complex than most medieval villages. There were probably lice dynasties that lasted longer than actual human dynasties, passing down prime real estate locations from one generation of lice to the next. The medieval solution to lice was typically just acceptance. You had lice, your spouse had lice, your children had lice, your parents had lice, and your neighbours had lice. It was a shared community experience, like church attendance or dying of preventable diseases. Some people would try to remove lice by hand, which was a social activity. Families would sit together in the evening, picking lice out of each other's hair while discussing the day's events, like a medieval version of family bonding time, except with more parasites and less emotional warmth. But the real stars of the medieval bedroom horror show were the rats and mice. These weren't cute cartoon rodents. These were medieval rats that had survived the same harsh conditions that were killing humans left and right. They were tough, smart, and absolutely fearless. Medieval rats looked at human sleeping areas and saw all-inclusive resorts with room service. These rodents had free run of medieval houses because there was basically no way to keep them out. The wattle and daub walls had gaps, the thatched roofs were like rat highways, and the dirt floors provided excellent tunneling opportunities. Rats would build entire civilizations inside the walls of medieval houses, complete with nurseries, food storage areas, and probably tiny rat taverns where they shared stories about the stupid humans they lived with. Medieval peasants would wake up to find that rats had eaten their food, chewed holes in their clothes, nested in their bedding, and left small presents throughout their living space. The rats weren't just stealing food, they were actively redesigning the interior decor according to their own aesthetic preferences, which apparently involved scattering droppings everywhere and chewing decorative holes in everything. The medieval approach to rat control was about what you'd expect from people who thought illness was caused by bad smells. They would try various methods that were approximately as effective as asking the rats nicely to leave. Some would use cats, but medieval cats were often too busy trying not to starve to death to worry about pest control. Others would set primitive traps, which the rats quickly learned to avoid, or in some cases actually use as tools for their own purposes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements was the sanitation situation, or rather, the complete absence of anything resembling sanitation. Remember, these were people who shared one room with their entire families and their livestock, and they had about as much understanding of hygiene as they had of quantum physics. Let's talk about medieval toilet arrangements, because you can't discuss sleeping without discussing what happened when nature called in the middle of the night. Most peasant houses had no toilet facilities whatsoever. The bathroom was outside, if there was a bathroom at all. More often, there was just a designated area behind the house where everyone did their business, creating what could generously be called an outdoor restroom, and more accurately described as a biological hazard zone. But what happened when it was the middle of winter, there was a blizzard outside, and little Timmy really needed to go? Well, medieval peasants had a solution that speaks to their practical approach to survival: the chamber pot. This was essentially a bowl or bucket that stayed inside the house for nighttime emergencies and winter weather situations. Now, you might think, well, that's not so bad. At least they had indoor bathroom facilities. Oh, my sweet modern friend. The chamber pot wasn't emptied after each use. It wasn't emptied daily. It was emptied when it was full, or when the smell became so overwhelming that even medieval noses, which were accustomed to smells that would hospitalize modern humans, couldn't tolerate it anymore. This chamber pot sat in the corner of the one room where the entire family lived, slept, ate, and spent their entire lives. It was like having a portable toilet in your bedroom. except it was never serviced and everyone in your family used it regularly. The aroma that emanated from this medieval bathroom fixture added another delightful layer to the already complex bouquet of smells that characterized medieval peasant homes. And let's talk about personal hygiene, because this is where things get really medieval. The average peasant might bathe once or twice a year, if they were particularly hygiene conscious. Most bathed even less frequently. Full-body bathing was considered unhealthy, potentially immoral, and possibly dangerous. Medieval medical theory suggested that bathing too much would open the pores and allow disease to enter the body, which explains why medieval people were so remarkably healthy and definitely not constantly dying of preventable illnesses. Instead of bathing, medieval peasants practiced what could generously be called spot cleaning. They might wash their hands and face occasionally, usually with cold water, and they might change their undergarments if they had any, and if those undergarments hadn't completely disintegrated from wear and accumulated filth. This meant that when the entire family piled onto their shared mattress for warmth, they were bringing months or even years of accumulated dirt, sweat, food residue, animal droppings, and other substances that are better left unidentified. The medieval bed was essentially a petri dish with blankets, a biological experiment that would make modern scientists either fascinated or physically ill. The clothing situation added another layer of complexity to medieval sleeping arrangements. People slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, and these clothes were rarely washed. Medieval laundry was an enormous undertaking that required significant resources: water, soap, if available, fuel for heating the water, and time that could be spent on more immediately pressing survival activities. When clothes were washed, which might happen a few times a year for the lucky ones, the entire process took days. The clothes had to be soaked, scrubbed by hand with harsh soap that could strip skin as easily as it cleaned fabric, rinsed multiple times and then dried, which in winter might take weeks. During this time, the person either wore their backup clothes, if they had any, or just went without, which in medieval winter was not a viable option. So people wore the same clothes day and night, week after week, sometimes month after month. These clothes accumulated not just dirt and sweat, but also all the lovely substances that characterized medieval daily life. Animal waste from working with livestock, food stains from eating with their hands, blood from various injuries and medical procedures, and whatever mysterious substances they encountered in their daily struggle for survival. When the family settled down for the night, they were essentially creating a human sandwich of unwashed bodies wrapped in unwashed clothes under unwashed blankets, seasoned with the ambient aroma of their chamber pot and whatever was decomposing in their walls and roof. It was like a sensory experience designed by someone who had never heard of pleasant sensory experiences. But wait, there's more. Medieval peasant houses often had animals living inside during winter, because animals needed shelter too, and building separate shelters required resources that most peasants didn't have. So the family shared their one room not just with each other, but with pigs, goats, chickens, and other livestock that brought their own special contributions to the medieval bedroom atmosphere. These animals had their own hygiene standards, which is to say, they had no hygiene standards whatsoever. They urinated and defecated wherever they happened to be standing when the urge struck them. They tracked in mud, manure, and other outdoor substances. They had their own collections of fleas, lice, and parasites, which they generously shared with their human roommates. The medieval approach to this situation was, predictably, just acceptance. Animals were valuable for survival, so their presence indoors was a necessity, not a choice. The alternative was losing the animals to cold, theft, or predators, which meant losing a major source of food, materials, and labor. So families learned to sleep alongside pigs that snored louder than freight trains, and chickens that had strong opinions about appropriate roosting locations. This created a sleeping environment that was part bedroom, part barn, part refugee camp, and part biological warfare experiment. The noise level alone would have made peaceful sleep nearly impossible, even if all the other conditions had been perfect. Medieval peasant houses at night were filled with the sounds of snoring humans, grunting pigs, clucking chickens, crying babies, coughing elders, scurrying rats, and the general creaking and settling sounds of a structure that was doing its best to not collapse under the weight of its own inadequacy. And then there were the winter nights when the cold became so severe that normal survival strategies weren't enough. When the temperature dropped below what the human body could endure even with all their warming techniques, medieval peasants had to get creative in ways that speak to both human ingenuity and human desperation. Some families would create what could generously be called human sleeping piles, where everyone in the house, plus any neighbours who had lost their heating, would pile together in a massive heap of humanity. Imagine trying to sleep while pressed between your grandmother, your neighbour's teenage son, a family of strangers whose house had burned down, and possibly a goat, all breathing heavily and contributing their own unique aromas to the enclosed space. Others would employ the shared body heat rotation system, where family members would take turns being in the middle of the pile, surrounded by the warmth of other bodies, before rotating to the outside, where they would gradually freeze until it was their turn in the middle again. This created a sleeping arrangement that was part slumber party, part survival strategy, and part slow-motion group hypothermia. The truly desperate would resort to even more extreme measures. Some would heat rocks or bricks by the fire and then place them throughout the bed, creating a medieval version of heated mattresses, except with the constant risk of burns, fires, or having a heated rock roll onto your face in the middle of the night. Others would create insulation layers using whatever materials were available. Layers of rags, old grain sacks, animal hides, and even dried grass or leaves would be piled on top of the sleeping family, creating a makeshift insulation system that was probably effective at trapping heat, but also highly effective at trapping every smell, parasite, and toxic substance in the immediate vicinity. And let's not forget the medieval approach to illness, because people got sick in medieval times with impressive frequency and creativity. When someone in the family was ill, which was most of the time, they didn't get moved to a separate room for quarantine. There was only one room. The sick person continued to share the family bed, spreading whatever they had to everyone else while receiving the medieval equivalent of medical care, which usually involved prayer, herbal remedies that were as likely to be poisonous as helpful, and the occasional application of leeches or bloodletting. This created a sleeping environment that was also a disease transmission laboratory. Families would pass illnesses back and forth like a medieval version of hot potato, except the hot potato was dysentery, influenza, or one of the many colourful plague variants that swept through Europe with depressing regularity. The medieval medical understanding of disease transmission was approximately equivalent to their understanding of aviation or democratic governance, which meant that families had no idea why they kept getting sick and dying. They just accepted it as part of life, like cold winters, or the fact that most of their children wouldn't live to adulthood. So there you have it. The complete medieval bedroom experience was essentially a perfect storm of everything that could possibly make sleep unpleasant, unhealthy, and potentially fatal. It was cold, crowded, smelly, loud, infested with parasites, contaminated with disease, and shared with both family members and livestock who had their own ideas about appropriate bedroom behavior. And yet, somehow, these people managed to survive, reproduce, and even occasionally thrive under these conditions. They developed strategies, adaptations, and a level of tolerance for discomfort that would impress modern military survival experts. They found ways to rest and recover enough to face another day of medieval existence, which was itself an impressive feat of human endurance. The next time you're trying to fall asleep and you're bothered by the neighbour's music being too loud, or the room being a degree too warm, or your pillow not being quite fluffy enough, just remember Wilhelm and his medieval family, huddled together, in their straw-filled sack, surrounded by livestock, parasites, and the constant threat of death, somehow making it through another night in humanity's most impressively miserable era. But we're still not done exploring this medieval sleeping nightmare. We haven't even gotten to the seasonal variations, the regional differences, or the truly creative solutions that some medieval peasants developed to make their sleeping situations slightly less horrible. And trust me, some of their innovations were so bizarre that they make modern survival reality shows look like luxury vacations. Now that we've thoroughly established that medieval bedrooms were basically biological warfare zones masquerading as sleeping arrangements, let's explore the truly fascinating world of regional variations in medieval misery. Because apparently, different parts of Europe had their own unique and creative approaches to making sleep as uncomfortable and potentially fatal as possible. You see, medieval peasants weren't content with having just one universal standard of sleeping horror. Oh no, that would be too simple. Instead, they developed regional specialties in bedroom nightmares, like a twisted medieval tourism campaign. Visit Northern England for our innovative underground sleeping arrangements, or experience the authentic alpine sleeping experience now, with 30% more hypothermia risk. Let's start with our friends in Scandinavia, who looked at the general medieval standard of sleeping in conditions that would make a prisoner of war camp seem luxurious, and said, "Hold my mead, watch this." Scandinavian winters weren't just cold, they were the kind of cold that makes other types of cold feel embarrassed about calling themselves cold. These were winters where stepping outside without proper preparation was basically suicide, and proper preparation consisted of everything you owned plus some things you'd borrowed from dead neighbours. The brilliant Scandinavian solution to this challenge was something they called the longhouse, which was basically a medieval apartment complex, except instead of different families having separate units, everyone just lived together in one enormous room. Imagine a medieval studio apartment, but instead of being designed for one person, it housed entire extended families, plus their servants, plus their animals, plus whoever else needed shelter, and happened to be nearby when the weather turned deadly. These longhouses were impressive structures that could house 50 to 100 people during winter months. The sleeping arrangements were what you might expect from cramming that many medieval people into one space. Absolutely chaotic. People slept in rows along the walls, like human storage units, with families claiming sections of floor space that became their temporary territories for the winter months. The central feature of the longhouse was an enormous fire pit that ran down the middle of the building, providing heat and light for the entire community. This sounds great in theory, until you realise that medieval fire safety standards were approximately equivalent to their understanding of quantum mechanics. Having a massive open fire surrounded by 50 people sleeping on straw mattresses under a wooden roof was basically a disaster waiting to happen, and disasters happened with impressive regularity. But the Scandinavians had an interesting approach to the smoke problem that plagued most medieval heating systems. Instead of trying to vent all the smoke outside, they partially embraced it as a feature rather than a bug. The smoke would fill the upper portions of the longhouse, creating a warm layer that helped insulate the building, while the lower areas where people actually lived remained relatively smoke-free. It was like living in a building that was perpetually on fire, but in a controlled, intentional way. The sleeping arrangements in these longhouses created their own unique social dynamics. Privacy was not just impossible, it was a concept that didn't even exist. Everyone knew everyone else's business because everyone else's business was happening 3 feet away from them. Family arguments became community entertainment, romantic encounters required scheduling and possibly audience participation, and personal hygiene became a group project. Meanwhile, down in the Mediterranean regions, medieval peasants faced different challenges and developed correspondingly different sleeping nightmares. Southern European winters were generally less likely to kill you through freezing, but they made up for this kindness with their own special varieties of misery. Italian and Spanish peasants often lived in stone houses that were beautifully cool during the hot summers and absolutely frigid during the winters. Stone is an excellent material for many things, but thermal comfort is not one of them. These houses would absorb cold during winter months and radiate it back at the sleeping inhabitants like medieval air conditioning systems designed by someone who had never heard of comfort. The Mediterranean approach to bedding was influenced by their different climate and available materials. Instead of the straw-stuffed mattresses common in northern Europe, southern peasants often used materials like wool, cotton when they could get it, or even dried seaweed in coastal areas. This sounds like an improvement until you realise that medieval wool processing created materials that were roughly as soft as modern steel wool, and dried seaweed brought its own collection of maritime parasites, and an aroma that could clear a room, faster than a declaration of plague. But the real innovation in Mediterranean sleeping arrangements was their approach to pest control, which was both more sophisticated and more terrifyingly creative than their northern counterparts. Southern European peasants had access to different herbs and plants, which they used to create pest-repelling mixtures that they would spread around their sleeping areas. These herbal mixtures were usually effective against some pests while simultaneously attracting others, creating a constantly shifting ecosystem of creatures that were either fleeing from or being drawn to the medieval bedroom. It was like playing a complex strategy game where the pieces were various insects and parasites, and the objective was to achieve some kind of balance that would allow for occasional sleep. The truly creative Mediterranean peasants would employ what historians now call strategic pest management, which involved deliberately introducing certain creatures to control other creatures. For example, some families would encourage spiders to live in their bedrooms because spiders ate other insects. This worked great until you realised that you were now sharing your sleeping space with medieval spiders, which were probably larger, more aggressive, and more venomous than modern spiders, because everything was more hardcore in medieval times. Moving north to the Germanic regions, we find perhaps the most engineering-focused approach to medieval sleeping arrangements. German peasants, displaying the same systematic approach to problem-solving that would later give the world precision manufacturing and unnecessarily complicated Christmas traditions, developed sleeping systems that were impressively complex and usually completely ineffective. The German innovation was something called the sleeping alcove, which was basically a closet built into the wall where the family would sleep. These alcoves could be closed off from the rest of the house, creating a smaller space that was easier to heat and providing some semblance of privacy. It sounds like a reasonable idea until you realize that it was essentially a human-sized oven that could either keep you warm or suffocate you, with very little middle ground between the two options. These sleeping closets were usually just large enough for a family to lie down, but not tall enough to sit up in. Getting into and out of bed required a complex gymnastics routine, and once everyone was inside, the space was so cramped that turning over required family coordination and possibly an engineering degree. The German approach to heating these alcoves involved various techniques that displayed impressive innovation and equally impressive potential for disaster. Some families would use heated stones, but the German version involved a complex system of stone heating, transportation and placement that turned bedtime into a logistical operation requiring multiple people and careful timing. Others would use what could generously be called breath-warming systems, where the family would breathe into containers or under blankets to create pockets of warmed air. This technique worked by trapping exhaled air, which was warmer than the ambient temperature, creating small warm zones within the sleeping area. The downside was that you were essentially breathing your own exhaled air all night, which in a sealed space with multiple people could lead to oxygen depletion and carbon dioxide buildup, turning sleep into a slow-motion suffocation experience. But perhaps the most fascinating regional variation was found in the Alpine regions, where the combination of extreme cold, mountainous terrain, and limited resources led to sleeping arrangements that were so bizarre they seemed like they were designed by someone who had never actually tried to sleep. Alpine peasants often lived in houses that were built directly into hillsides, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. These semi-underground houses stayed warmer than surface buildings, but they also had the delightful characteristic of being damp, poorly ventilated, and prone to flooding during spring melts or heavy rains. Sleeping in an underground house during winter meant dealing with constant moisture, limited airflow, and the ever-present risk of the roof collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow. The walls would sweat condensation, the floors would be perpetually damp, and the air would be thick with humidity and the combined exhalations of multiple families living in connected underground chambers. The Alpine solution to this moisture problem was typically to embrace it as part of the experience. They would use materials that could absorb moisture, like certain types of moss or specially treated animal hides, creating bedding systems that were essentially designed to be damp. It was like sleeping in a controlled swamp, except the swamp was underground and surrounded by mountains and potential avalanches. But the truly innovative Alpine peasants developed what might be the most bizarre sleeping arrangement in medieval Europe, the heating human system. This involved designating one family member, usually a teenager or young adult, whose job was to stay awake and generate heat for the sleeping family through continuous physical activity. This heating human would spend the night doing exercises, moving around the sleeping area, and occasionally lying down next to different family members to share body heat before getting up to generate more warmth through movement. It was like having a human furnace that required no fuel except food and created no fire risk, except for the minor detail that it required one person to sacrifice their sleep for the benefit of everyone else. The heating human position rotated among family members, creating a medieval shift system where everyone took turns being the designated heat generator. This meant that no one actually got a full night's sleep, but everyone got some sleep, which in the medieval Alpine winter was considered a reasonable compromise. Moving to the British Isles, we discover that English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish peasants had developed their own unique approaches to sleeping in conditions that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. British winters were characterized by dampness, cold and a persistent drizzle that could penetrate any structure that wasn't specifically designed to keep water out, which described most peasant housing. The British approach to this challenge was to essentially give up on staying dry, and instead focus on staying alive despite being perpetually wet. British peasant houses were built to shed water rather than keep it out entirely, meaning that sleeping areas were designed with the assumption that everything would be at least slightly damp at all times. British bedding systems incorporated this dampness as a design feature. Mattresses were often raised on platforms that allowed air circulation underneath, preventing the bottom from becoming completely waterlogged. Blankets were made from materials that retained some insulating properties, even when wet, like certain types of wool that had been treated with animal fats. The British also developed sophisticated drainage systems for their sleeping areas, with channels and slopes designed to direct water away from where people actually lay down. Medieval British bedrooms were essentially engineered flood control systems that happened to have sleeping spaces incorporated into them. But perhaps the most distinctively British contribution to medieval sleeping arrangements was the concept of communal bed warming, which took the basic human pile approach and added distinctly British elements of social organisation and class. Consciousness. Even within peasant families, there were hierarchies of bed positioning. The patriarch got the warmest spot, usually closest to whatever heat source was available. The matriarch got the second best position, then adult children in order of age and usefulness to family survival, then actual children, and finally, any elderly relatives who were no longer productive but whom the family couldn't afford to abandon. This created sleeping arrangements that were like medieval seating charts, except instead of determining who sat where at dinner, it determined who got to survive the night and who might freeze to death by morning. Family politics played out in bed positioning, with alliances, rivalries and power struggles all reflected in who got to sleep where. The British also developed what might be called strategic snoring management, recognizing that in a crowded sleeping arrangement, snoring could keep everyone awake, which could be fatal when everyone needed rest to survive the next day's labor. Families would position heavy snorers in specific locations where their snoring would be less disruptive, sometimes even building small separate alcoves for family members whose snoring threatened the sleep health of the entire household. But the most impressive British innovation was the bed rotation system, where families would have multiple sleeping locations within their house and would rotate through them based on weather conditions, seasonal changes, and strategic considerations. During the coldest weather, everyone would sleep in the smallest, most insulated space. During slightly warmer periods, they might spread out to larger areas. During wet seasons, they would move to the areas with the best drainage. This system required impressive logistical planning and coordination, turning bedtime into a military operation where family members had assigned positions, backup plans, and contingency strategies. It was like a medieval version of musical chairs, except instead of music, there was the constant sound of people coughing, snoring, and trying not to die of hypothermia. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Slavic peasants had developed their own unique approaches to surviving winter nights that combined elements from all these other regional variations while adding their own special touches that speak to both creativity and desperation. The Eastern European innovation was the community heating cooperative, where multiple families would essentially merge their households during the worst winter months, sharing resources, space, and body heat in carefully organized survival communities. These weren't just temporary arrangements. They were sophisticated social organizations with rules, hierarchies, and systems for managing conflicts that inevitably arose when dozens of people lived together in survival conditions. These winter cooperatives would take over the largest available building in a village and convert it into a massive communal sleeping area. The sleeping arrangements were organized not just by family but by compatibility, body heat generation, snoring patterns, and disease status. It was like medieval speed dating, except instead of finding romance, people were finding optimal sleeping partners for survival purposes. The Eastern Europeans also developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to medieval sleep scheduling. Instead of the simple, segmented sleep pattern common elsewhere, they created complex rotation systems where different groups of people would sleep at different times, ensuring that someone was always awake to tend fires, watch for dangers, and manage the logistics of keeping dozens of people alive in one space. These sleep schedules were coordinated with work schedules, food preparation, childcare, and all the other necessities of medieval survival, creating communities that operated like medieval shift factories dedicated to the production of survival. It was impressively organized and probably the closest thing to effective resource management that medieval peasants ever achieved. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these regional variations was how they demonstrate the incredible adaptability of human beings. Each region faced different challenges: extreme cold, dampness, limited resources, dangerous wildlife, geological hazards, and in each case, people found ways to not just survive, but to create social systems that allowed communities to endure, conditions that would break modern people. These weren't just survival strategies, they were cultural innovations that were passed down through generations, refined and improved over centuries of trial and error, and eventually became integral parts of regional identity. The way people slept became part of who they were, and the sleeping arrangements that developed in different regions reflected the values, priorities, and survival strategies of different cultures. And yet, for all their regional variations and cultural innovations, these medieval sleeping arrangements shared certain universal characteristics. They were all uncomfortable, they were all potentially dangerous, they all involved accepting levels of cold, dampness, pest infestation, and lack of privacy that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. But they worked. Somehow, despite conditions that seem almost impossibly harsh, people survived. They found ways to rest, to recover, to maintain the energy and health necessary to face another day of medieval existence. They developed social bonds, raised families, and created the foundation for future generations that would eventually develop better ways to stay warm at night. The next time you're adjusting your programmable thermostat or complaining about your mattress being too firm, take a moment to appreciate not just the comfort of your modern sleeping arrangements, but the incredible journey of human ingenuity and endurance that made those comforts possible. You're sleeping better than medieval royalty could have imagined, and infinitely better than the peasants who somehow survived winter after winter, using nothing but creativity, cooperation, and an impressive tolerance for misery. But don't get too comfortable yet. We still need to talk about the truly desperate measures that medieval peasants employed when their regular sleeping arrangements weren't sufficient, the seasonal variations that made some times of year even worse than others, and the remarkable ways that medieval people tried to make their sleeping situations just a little bit less horrible. Because apparently, when you're already sleeping in conditions that resemble a survival reality show designed by sadists, there's still room for innovation in the field of creative misery management. Where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? Part 4. Welcome to the grand finale of our medieval sleeping nightmare tour, where we're about to explore the most desperate, creative, and frankly unhinged solutions that medieval peasants came up with when their regular sleeping arrangements, which we've already established were basically organized suffering, simply weren't horrible enough to keep them alive through the worst winter nights. You thought sharing a straw mattress with your entire family plus livestock was bad. You thought sleeping in a smoke-filled room surrounded by parasites was rough. Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the emergency protocols of medieval survival, the backup plans that kicked in when the already terrible regular plans weren't working. These were the sleeping strategies that medieval peasants used when winter stopped playing around and got serious about trying to kill everyone. Let's start with what happened during the absolute worst winter nights. Those legendary medieval cold snaps that modern historians call crisis winters, but which medieval peasants probably called something much more colourful and significantly less printable. These were the winters that made regular medieval winters look like tropical vacations, the kind of cold that could kill a healthy adult in hours and turn a typical peasant house into a medieval-themed ice sculpture. During these crisis periods, normal sleeping arrangements were abandoned entirely in favour of what can only be described as human hibernation protocols. Entire villages would essentially shut down and focus exclusively on survival, with multiple families moving into whatever building offered the best chance of not dying before spring. The building of choice was usually the local church, if there was one, because churches were often the largest and most solidly constructed buildings in medieval villages. The irony was that people who spent most of their lives being told that they were sinners who deserved suffering would pile into God's house to escape the suffering that was literally trying to kill them. Medieval theology was complicated, but apparently survival trumped religious protocol when the alternative was becoming a frozen corpse. These emergency church sleeping arrangements were like refugee camps, except the disaster was just winter being winter, and the refugees were the entire population of the village. Families would claim sections of floor space, usually near the altar where body heat could be concentrated, and create massive human sleeping piles that defied both physics and medieval social norms. The church sleeping system required its own social organization. Someone had to manage the fire, which was usually built right in the center of the church, despite the obvious fire safety issues of having an open flame in a wooden building filled with dozens of people sleeping on straw. Others had to organize food distribution, waste management, and the complex logistics of keeping that many people alive in one space. But the most important role was that of the death monitor, someone whose job was to stay awake and check for people who had died during the night. This wasn't just a morbid precaution. Dead bodies in a crowded survival situation could spread disease, and in extreme cold, people could die so quietly that others might not notice until morning. The death monitor would make rounds throughout the night, checking for breathing and occasionally poking people to make sure they were still alive, rather than just extremely still. The death monitor position rotated among the adults because staying awake all night in those conditions was essentially a death sentence in itself. It was a job that required someone to sacrifice their own survival chances for the benefit of everyone else, which speaks to the impressive level of community cooperation that extreme survival situations could create, even among people who probably didn't like each other very much under normal circumstances. But even more desperate than the church sleeping arrangements were the emergency protocols that kicked in when the church wasn't available, wasn't large enough, or had burned down, which happened with depressing frequency. This is where medieval peasants had to get truly creative, developing survival strategies that sound like they were invented by someone who had never heard of survival strategies, but was really, really motivated to not die. One of the most extreme emergency sleeping arrangements was something historians call snow cave cohabitation, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. When buildings weren't available or weren't providing adequate protection, families would dig caves into snowbanks and essentially hibernate like human bears, except bears are actually well adapted for hibernation, while humans are spectacularly poorly designed for spending weeks underground in frozen conditions. These snow caves were engineering marvels of desperation. They had to be large enough to accommodate multiple people, but small enough to be heated by body warmth alone. They needed ventilation to prevent suffocation, but not so much ventilation that all the heat escaped. They required drainage systems to handle melting snow and human waste, structural support to prevent collapse, and entrance systems that could be sealed against wind while still allowing emergency exit. The construction of these caves was a community effort that required skills that most medieval peasants didn't actually have. They had to estimate load-bearing capacity, design ventilation systems, and create structural supports using materials that were basically just more snow, sticks, and whatever scraps they could find. It was like asking people who had never seen an engineering textbook to build underground survival shelters using only medieval technology and pure desperation. The sleeping arrangements inside these snow caves were even more challenging than regular medieval sleeping situations. Everyone had to lie together in configurations designed to maximize heat sharing while minimizing the risk of suffocation, crushing, or accidentally blocking the ventilation systems. It was like a puzzle where all the pieces were human beings who were slowly freezing to death, and the solution had to keep everyone alive until spring. But perhaps even more extreme than snow caves were the emergency protocols used in areas where snow caves weren't feasible. In regions with rocky terrain or other geological challenges, medieval peasants developed what can only be called body heat farming strategies that turned human beings into their own heating systems through carefully organized continuous movement. The body heat farming system required dividing people into shifts where some slept while others performed continuous physical activity to generate heat for the group. The active people would do exercises, move around the sleeping area, and essentially function as human heating units while the sleeping people rested. Then they would rotate, with the heated people lying down to sleep, while the previously sleeping people took over heat generation duties. This system meant that no one ever got a full night's sleep, but everyone got some sleep, and everyone stayed warm enough to avoid freezing to death. It was like having a gym membership, except instead of paying money for the privilege of exercising, you had to exercise to avoid dying, and your workout equipment was just your own body and whatever space you could find. The exercises weren't recreational fitness routines. They were carefully designed movements that generated maximum heat while using minimum calories, because food was always scarce during emergency survival situations. People would do controlled muscle contractions, gentle calisthenics, and movements that kept blood circulating without burning through their already limited energy reserves. Some communities developed elaborate body heat farming systems that resembled medieval shift work, with complex schedules, designated roles, and systems for monitoring everyone's health and energy levels. It was like running a factory where the product was survival and the raw materials were human endurance and the collective will to not die. But even these extreme survival strategies had their seasonal variations, because apparently medieval winters weren't content with just being uniformly horrible. They had to have special seasonal features that made different parts of winter uniquely terrible in their own special ways. Early winter, for example, was characterized by what medieval people called the deception, which sounds like a philosophical concept, but was actually just their term for weather that seemed manageable, but was actually slowly killing everyone. Early winter cold was often accompanied by dampness that made regular heating methods less effective, creating conditions where people thought they were staying warm, but were actually experiencing gradual hypothermia. The sleeping strategies for early winter required constant vigilance and adjustment. What worked in dry cold didn't work in damp cold, and what worked in moderate cold could be fatal in severe cold. Families had to constantly monitor each other for signs of hypothermia, frostbite, and the various stages of cold-related death, because medieval medical knowledge didn't include much understanding of how cold actually killed people. Midwinter brought what they called the siege, where cold became so severe and persistent that it was like being under attack by an enemy that never retreated and never negotiated. Midwinter sleeping arrangements focused on fortress strategies, creating the most defensible positions possible and maintaining them no matter what. During midwinter, families would often abandon parts of their houses entirely, sealing off rooms that couldn't be adequately heated and concentrating everyone into whatever space could be kept marginally habitable. It was like strategic retreat, except instead of retreating from human enemies, they were retreating from physics and meteorology. Late winter brought what they called the betrayal, where warmer days would trick people into relaxing their survival vigilance just before sudden cold snaps that could kill anyone who had let their guard down. Late winter sleeping arrangements had to be rapidly adaptable, capable of scaling up or down based on sudden weather changes that could happen overnight. The seasonal variations also affected the social dynamics of sleeping arrangements. Early winter communities were often still optimistic and cooperative. Midwinter communities were focused and grimly determined. Late winter communities were often characterized by desperation, interpersonal conflicts, and the kind of decision-making that comes from months of stress, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these medieval sleeping arrangements was how they shaped the development of European culture in ways that are still visible today. The necessity of community cooperation for survival created social bonds and cultural practices that lasted long after heating technology made extreme survival sleeping unnecessary. Many European traditions around hospitality, community support, and collective responsibility can be traced back to these medieval sleeping survival strategies. The idea that communities have obligations to help members survive difficult times, the traditions of sharing resources during emergencies, and the cultural emphasis on cooperation over individual achievement all have roots in the practical necessities of medieval winter survival. The sleeping arrangements also influenced architecture, not just in terms of heating efficiency, but in terms of social space design. The ways that European houses are laid out, the relationships between public and private spaces, and the integration of work and living areas all reflect lessons learned from centuries of survival sleeping. Even modern European attitudes toward privacy, personal space, and family relationships show influences from medieval sleeping arrangements. The high value placed on privacy in modern European culture makes more sense when you understand that privacy was essentially impossible for most of European history, making it a precious commodity that people learned to value precisely because they couldn't have it. But beyond the cultural implications, these medieval sleeping arrangements represent something remarkable about human adaptability and cooperation. People found ways to survive conditions that should have been unsurvivable, not through individual heroics or superior technology, but through collective action, shared sacrifice, and the kind of social cooperation that emerges when everyone understands that they either survive together or die together. The medieval peasants who developed these sleeping strategies weren't superhuman. They weren't specially adapted for extreme survival conditions. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, and they found ways to not just survive, but to maintain communities, raise families, and preserve the knowledge and culture that would eventually lead to better living conditions for future generations. They did this despite having access to technology that we would consider primitive, medical knowledge that was often worse than no medical knowledge at all, and resources that were barely adequate for survival even under ideal conditions. They succeeded through cooperation, creativity, and an impressive willingness to endure discomfort that would break most modern people within days. So the next time you're lying in your comfortable bed, in your temperature-controlled room, under your clean sheets, with your fluffy pillow, take a moment to appreciate not just the physical comfort of your sleeping arrangements, but the incredible, journey of human ingenuity, cooperation and endurance that made those comforts possible, you're not just sleeping better than medieval peasants. You're benefiting from centuries of accumulated knowledge, technological development and social organization that built upon the foundation of survival strategies developed by people who had to choose between freezing to death and sharing a flea-infested straw mattress with their entire extended family plus livestock. Your modern sleeping arrangements represent the culmination of humanity's longest-running research and development project, figuring out how to get a decent night's sleep without dying in the process. Medieval peasants were the beta testers for human sleeping technology, and they debugged the most serious problems like hypothermia, suffocation, and being eaten by parasites, so that you could enjoy the luxury of complaining about thread counts and mattress firmness. But here's the thing that makes this story both inspiring and slightly unsettling. If modern civilization collapsed tomorrow, if our heating systems failed, if our supply chains broke down, if our technological solutions to basic survival problems suddenly weren't available, most of us would have absolutely no idea how to implement even the most basic medieval survival sleeping strategies. We've gained incredible comfort and safety, but we've also lost the knowledge, skills, and social cooperation abilities that allowed our ancestors to survive under conditions that would kill us in days. We're completely dependent on complex technological and social systems that we mostly don't understand, maintained by other people using knowledge and skills that we don't have. Medieval peasants were poor, cold, uncomfortable, and constantly threatened by death. But they were also remarkably resilient, adaptable, and capable of surviving under almost any conditions. Modern people are comfortable, warm, well-fed, and generally safe, but we're also remarkably fragile and dependent on systems that we take for granted. This isn't an argument for returning to medieval living conditions. Trust me, nobody wants to go back to sharing a bed with pigs and lice. But it is a reminder that the comfort and security of modern life came at the cost of losing survival skills and community cooperation abilities that served humanity well for thousands of years. So appreciate your modern sleeping arrangements not just for their comfort, but for what they represent: the successful completion of humanity's most important long-term project, which was figuring out how to get a good night's sleep without it being a potentially fatal adventure. And maybe, just maybe, take some inspiration from those medieval peasants who found ways to survive, thrive, and maintain hope under conditions that seem impossible from our modern perspective. They remind us that humans are capable of remarkable adaptation, cooperation, and endurance when circumstances require it. Just hopefully we'll never need to test those capabilities ourselves. Because while medieval sleeping arrangements make for fascinating historical study and entertaining comparisons to modern comfort, actually experiencing them would be considerably less fun than learning about them from the safety of our heated, pest-free private bedrooms. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're sleeping like royalty compared to 99% of all humans who have ever lived. Wilhelm and his medieval family would probably consider your worst night's sleep to be the height of luxury, and they'd be absolutely amazed that you have the privilege of complaining about being too warm instead of wondering whether you'll survive until morning. Now go adjust that thermostat, fluff those pillows, and enjoy the fact that your biggest bedtime worry is probably whether you remember to set your alarm, not whether the rats will eat your toes before the hypothermia kills you. You've earned it, thanks to centuries of people who figured out the hard way how to not freeze to death while sleeping, so that you never have to.